Hello, space friends. Like many of you, I've often looked to sci-fi characters as role models when I was a kid and even into adulthood. The Star Trek universe has some of the most interesting characters, and I'm on a kind of leadership kick lately, so instead of focusing on spaceships this time, let's look at Starship captains and Star Trek leaders and make a tier list of the most outstanding leaders in Star Trek. In this tier list, I've come up with a score system of 1 through 5, using 7 categories, and then average the rating across all the categories. The categories are strategy and tactics, diplomacy and communication, trust and loyalty, clarity and confidence, inspiration or charisma, moral intelligence or wisdom, and reputation. Each of these categories is very different but important overall. So for example, one could be an expert in Starship combat tactics, but unable to execute the strategy because no one is loyal to that person or trust them without question. One could also have excellent charisma and inspirational powers, but poor diplomacy and communication skills, so when negotiating with outsiders or attempting to resolve interpersonal issues within their own crew, it becomes a toxic mess. One could have high moral intelligence by knowing what is perceived as right or wrong, but little confidence and clarity. Therefore, they may come across as too preachy or emotional, or perhaps someone who is too nice and needs to be protected, but under no circumstances followed. So we'll do this in no particular order. I've got villain captains in here as well. I wish I could put a bunch in here, but I only have so much time. So we'll get started. We'll get started with one of my favorite villains, which is General Chang from Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Christopher Plummer played his role with excellence as always, as the charismatic but duplicitous Chang. In Star Trek VI alone, there is not quite enough material to flesh him out, but in the Klingon Academy series of games, Chang is the instructor at the Academy, and believe me, it will convince you that Klingons are not just marauding space barbarians, but able to plan and execute genius-level strategy and tactics. For strategy and tactics, he is up there with the best. I give him a 5. For diplomacy and communication, well, he is capable, but resents how much the Federation uses diplomacy to persuade others to join them. He sees conquest as more natural. However, when he speaks, he is very eloquent. I rate him at least a 3 in diplomacy and communication. For trust and loyalty, well, he trained many of the Starship commanders in the Klingon Defense Force. His only weakness in the loyalty department is his betrayal of Chancellor Gorkon, making him just a bit lacking in trust, so I'll give him a 4 here. For confidence and clarity of thought, he is mostly a clear thinker, and unlike most Klingons, he does not let his emotions get out of control, although he will often feign rage as a calculated tactic. He is shown to keep his cool even when facing certain death. I'll give him a 5 here for clarity and confidence. For inspiration and charisma, Chang often quotes Shakespeare or something with an equivalent depth of impact. This inspires his followers to do their best for something greater than themselves. His charisma is a solid 5. And finally, moral intelligence or wisdom. Although Chang is aware of the morality of certain situations, he won't let that get in the way of stabbing someone in the back if it suits his needs. He does not hesitate to kill or destroy someone, giving him a reputation for duplicity, but he believes in honoring what is right for the Klingon people. I will give him a 3 here. Total score for General Chang is 3.9, well, this will put him in the upper B tier. Next up is another Klingon, Commander Kruge, played by Christopher Lloyd from Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. For strategy and tactics, Kruge is patient and competent, but not perfect. Even under cloak, it does take a lot of skill to enter Federation space, I'll admit, but unlike his attack on the Grissom, where he attacked it from behind, he goes on with the frontal attack on the Enterprise, so that even if Enterprise wasn't ready, she could have retaliated and probably win under normal circumstances. He said it himself, they outgunned him 10 to 1, but he went on the attack anyway. So he gets a 3 for his strategy and tactics rating. For diplomacy and communication, well, he played his hand with the hostages well, but of course Kirk outsmarted him later, and here again he seems to be over-reliant on intimidation with his Klingon boarding nonsense and all. So I'm going to have to give him probably about a 3 for diplomacy and communication. For trust and loyalty, well, his close subordinates were totally loyal to him. He used fear to keep the rest of his crew in line, which is effective in the short term, and I believe the short term was all he was interested in, so I'll give him a 4 out of 5 for trust and loyalty. For confidence and clarity, in spite of the boldness of his strategy, he had absolutely no doubt about what he wanted to accomplish, and nothing would stop him short of his own death. I can't say he was a very clear thinker about what his strategy was, but I'll go ahead and give him a 4 here. For inspiration and charisma, from the perspective of the average Klingon, perhaps this would be pretty high, but he did not care at all about being an inspiration to anyone outside of his own command crew. So for this, I will give him a 3. For moral intelligence or wisdom, I believe Kruge's ultimate aim was to die, and if he accomplished the acquisition of the Genesis data to use as a weapon, this would be fine for him. But his moral considerations were only for himself to die as a Klingon, so for moral intelligence, I only give him a 2. For reputation, it's possible that his reputation was low to begin with at the beginning of Star Trek III, and this is why he wanted to do this mission to gain some recognition. He only commanded a bird of prey, and seemed a bit older for a Klingon. Perhaps he was nearing the end of his career and wanted to go out with a glorious bang. So I'm going to give him a 2 for reputation. So this averages to a 3.0, which puts him in C tier. Next up we have another villain, Shinzon, which is literally Picard's evil clone from Star Trek Nemesis, who was cloned by the Romulans as a bold plan to infiltrate the Federation. In Shinzon's battle with the Enterprise E and the 2 Valdor-class warbirds, he demonstrated some very good tactical acumen. I can give Shinzon a solid 4 here. For diplomacy and communication, although he is not a master of it, he is quite competent. He was able to rally the Remans to his cause and actually had allies in the Romulan Navy. But as soon as he was in control, the Romulans almost immediately began plotting against him because of his shifty attitude. I'll give him a 3 for diplomacy and communication. For trust and loyalty, well, the Remans were completely and totally loyal to him, and vice versa, having enduring Reman minds together. But outside of that, no one really trusted him at all. So here I'll have to give him a 3. For confidence and clarity, unfortunately for him by design, he was on the clock to get a total implantation of blood from Picard, or the automatic aging process would kill him. This led him to increasingly more impatient actions and certain indulgences. He also wrestled with an inferiority complex regarding Picard. Perhaps without his condition, this confidence and clarity would be higher, but as it stands, it's at 3. For inspiration and charisma, Shinzon is eloquent in speech and very curious about all of those that he works with, but he has developed a prejudice against the Romulan elite. He's also had very little interaction with anyone outside of Remans, so he comes across as a little bit awkward and creepy, especially when first interacting with the crew of the Enterprise. So for charisma, he has the potential of being more charismatic, but I think for this we have to give him a 3. For moral intelligence, in spite of having the perfect potential role model in the clone of Jean-Luc Picard, he did not take Picard's example to heart at all. Instead, he chose self-pity. He is aware of morality, but instead chooses resentment that Picard is privileged while he is not, at least in his head. So for this, I give him a moral intelligence rating of only 2. His reputation and accomplishments were well known during the Dominion War, and he was able to rally the Remans under his banner. However, he had to assassinate the Romulan leadership to gain control of the Romulan Empire. Therefore, his reputation is only a 3. So on average, he's at 2.9, which puts him on the line between C and D tier, edging more towards C tier. Now, how about... That's right, one of the most famous villains, played by Ricardo Montalban. Khan is a genetically engineered superhuman who rallied other genetically augmented humans to gain control of a large portion of Earth, somewhere around the turn of the 21st century, but manages to escape the eugenics wars via a sleeper ship, which is recovered by the Enterprise some 200 years later. Of course, there was a big kerfuffle there where he almost took over the Enterprise, and then later he went into exile into SETI Alpha 5, and returns for one of the best Star Trek movies ever, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, where he very nearly destroyed the Enterprise. He has what he calls the superior intellect. He has 5 times the strength of the average human, and is ruthless in his efforts to exert control over others. For strategy and tactics, Khan is competent but inexperienced in the tactics used for the 23rd century in space combat. He has all the concepts down, but as Spock says, he seems to lack awareness of the third dimension, essential in space combat. In spite of the superior intellect, I could only give him a 3 for strategy and tactics in the 23rd century. Perhaps if he were given more time and experience, he would have fared far better. Now his diplomacy and communication are competent and eloquent, and he likes to use ultimatums to get what he wants, but he quite often underestimates the conviction of his enemies, such as Kirk and his crew. So we'll have to give him a 3 for diplomacy and communication. Now for trust and loyalty, among his genetically engineered colleagues who are sworn to live and die under his command, the trust and loyalty is total, and he was also able to gain the loyalty to some degree of Lieutenant MacGyver's, a Starfleet officer in the original series. So I'll give him a 4 for trust and loyalty. For clarity and confidence, well, I would say this deteriorated over time. By the time he escaped his exile in Ceti Alpha 5, he wanted revenge first and foremost. He was prone to rage, and he is even goaded into following Kirk into the nebula, which nullified many of his tactical advantages. On the other hand, he had a clear purpose in mind, and that was revenge on Admiral Kirk. So we'll give him a 3 here for clarity and confidence. For inspiration and charisma, you gotta admit, Khan has a knack for flair. He quotes Melville all the time, he likes to use metaphor to justify his missions, he is curious about others, and he can identify people's qualities and how they would be susceptible to his charms. I'll give him a good 4 here for inspiration and charisma. For moral intelligence, well, while he has little regard for most people who are not genetically enhanced as he is, and he will think nothing of inflicting pain, especially after he got out of his exile at Ceti Alpha 5, apparently when he was in control of a large portion of Earth, he had a very efficient regime, and life was not so bad under his regime. But this softening only applies when he has people's sworn loyalty. He's not a total nincompoop when it comes to moral intelligence, but I have to give him a 2 here, because he is a tyrant. And finally, reputation. Well, Khan has a reputation for being an enhanced human, but used his power to become a notorious dictator. When he was in control, he did not go out of the way to be cruel to his subordinates. Well, he gets a 3 for his notoriety as a conqueror, but outside of this notoriety as a conqueror, it was pretty invalid by the time of the 23rd century. So Khan's total is a 3.1, which puts him in C tier. Now how about an unusual one? How about Saru from Star Trek Discovery, especially when he was in command of the Discovery? Now Saru doesn't get regular command of the Discovery until later in the series, mostly after the Discovery is displaced through time into the 29th century and when Burnham is missing. As a Kelpian, his earlier character state was risk-averse and fearful, as his threat ganglia would often indicate. But after a certain point, he underwent the natural metamorphosis of Kelpian biology by losing his threat ganglia, and he became far more confident by the time he took command of the Discovery. He never did anything particularly genius when it came to strategy and tactics that I can recall. He relied on others for this, although he was never really incompetent either, so I would give him about a 3 when it comes to strategy and tactics. For diplomacy and communication, he was actually pretty effective. He was able to negotiate several peace treaties in the 29th century between Starfleet and other worlds. He also was very good at keeping crew morale high in difficult situations, which requires excellent interpersonal communication. I would almost give him a 5, but I know that there are even better people at diplomacy than Saru, so I'll give him a 4. When it comes to trust and loyalty, well, personally, I would very much feel okay under Saru's command. His loyalty and trust expanded both above him and below him. He had consideration for everyone. I'll give him a 5 here. Clarity and confidence were something he really struggled with at first when he still had his threat ganglia, but this totally changed when he lost them and he took command of Discovery. He was often very clear about what he wanted and could think clearly most of the time, but not quite with total clarity, so I'll give him a 4. Other than generally just being a good guy, there was nothing that really leapt out at us about Saru as far as natural charisma, but he had enough to function as a captain, so I'll give him a 3 when it comes to charisma. However, when it came to having a steady moral compass in the midst of a harrowing situation, he's seen as never faltering for a split second. I'll give his moral intelligence a solid 5. And finally, his reputation. Unfortunately, in the 23rd century, he didn't quite have the opportunity to gain a great reputation. But in the 29th century, he was well regarded and respected, even becoming an ambassador. So I think he deserves a 4 here. This gives him a rating total of about 4.3, which puts him in A tier. Okay, now for perhaps the most controversial one in Star Trek. Michael Burnham from Star Trek Discovery. Michael Burnham starts out as first officer to Captain Georgiou on the USS Shinzon. Unfortunately, in spite of her talents, she seems to have contributed to the outbreak of the war with the Klingons, disobeyed orders from her commander, and can be peripherally blamed for the death of Captain Georgiou. She spends several years climbing out of that sullied reputation. But when it comes to strategy and tactics, somehow Michael Burnham is something of a genius. I think I will actually give her a 5 here. She's able to pull solutions right out of the air for what seems to be impossible problems on the fly. Her diplomacy and communication style seems really helter-skelter, often colored with overly dramatic emotion that leads to toxic unprofessionalism. This did improve over time, however, but overall I would still just give her a 2 for communication and diplomacy. When it comes to trust and loyalty, her disregard for the chain of command promoted an atmosphere of disorganization and unprofessionalism. Those close to her trusted her, but only her extreme competence in whatever she did propped up this trust. So I would give this trust and loyalty rating a 3. Clarity of thought and confidence was always a struggle for her. She was always struggling to be recognized for her skills because of her brash and unpredictable behavior, and this continued even as a captain. I think I can only give her a 2 here. Now, her inspiration and charisma are pretty good. She liked to foster intimate and vulnerable connections with those around her who would often forgive her for such brash actions in spite of themselves. I will give her a 4 for charisma and inspiration. For moral intelligence, while she has a good grasp for reading the moral situation, she often was willing to force her method through to get what she perceived to be the right thing. Anytime you're seen to force your moral view, this creates a lot of resentment and resistance, so I have to give her a 3 here. And finally, reputation. Well, Burnham's reputation never fully recovered from her first appearance in Star Trek Discovery. She did participate in many good outcomes, but she garnered a reputation for being kind of a loose cannon. So for this, I'm going to give her a 2. Overall, she's at a lowish 3.0, putting her in C tier. Now, how about Captain Pike? The question is, how much are we going to use the Captain Pike from Strange New Worlds, or the original Captain Pike from Star Trek's first pilot, The Cage? Although they are slightly different, we don't get quite enough content about the original Pike to do a full assessment, so we'll kind of use mostly the Captain Pike version from Strange New Worlds. Although Pike is competent at strategy and tactics, he's better at choosing the best options, as presented by his crew, instead of coming up with anything on his own. There's the so-called Pike maneuver where he escaped that bit of business with the Gorn by slingshotting around a black hole, but gravity assist for spacecraft navigation is the oldest trick in the book, so I can only give him a 3 here. For diplomacy and communication, Pike is willing to put up his best effort into talking things out instead of choosing any kind of violence. Although he is not always successful at it, but he's very good at getting the best out of his crew and utilizing others to achieve their goals, so I can give him a solid 4 here. When it comes to trust and loyalty, there is virtually no one who is not enthusiastic about serving with Pike, and they trust him implicitly. I can give him a 5 for trust and loyalty. For clarity and confidence, he has a fairly cool head. I would give him a 5, but it did take him some real work to reconcile the knowledge of his eventual demise that he was really never meant to see. And by the beginning of the Strange New World, self-doubt plagued him. Although he eventually finds his confidence, I'll give him a 4 for clarity and confidence. For inspiration and charisma, if we're talking about the Strange New Worlds version of Pike, he's right up there with Kirk and Riker in his ability to use his charms for crew cohesion. I'll give him a 5 here. And for moral intelligence, well, Pike almost always had a good grasp on the right thing to do, but Pike is not really a deep thinker in this regard. and he often doesn't understand that morals from his point of view are not always the same from some other's point of view. So here I'll give him a 4. And then for reputation, well, he's not quite legendary, but he has quite a few accomplishments under his belt, so I'll give him a 4 here. His total rating is 4.3, and this puts Captain Pike in A tier. And now on to Riker from Star Trek The Next Generation. Now we'll be evaluating Riker's career mostly up until the end of his tenure on Star Trek The Next Generation, although he did go on to have a distinguishing career after that. Now when it comes to strategy and tactics, Riker in a lot of ways reminds me of Kirk. He is decisive but creative with the maneuvers he comes up with. He was even able to free Picard from the Borg when he was assimilated as Locutus, among many other demonstrations of great strategic and tactical acumen. So I will give Riker a 5 for strategy and tactics. For diplomacy and communication, I think he deserves a high 4 here. No, he's not quite in Picard's league, but he's never really blundered in negotiation and is able to utilize and delegate his crew as easily as Picard does. For trust and loyalty, Riker is very solid. Although Riker can be a risk taker, he does so in a manner that keeps everyone's best interests and well-being in mind, so I'll give him a 4 for trust and loyalty. For confidence and clarity, Riker is fairly solid here. He doesn't quite have the cool clarity of thought of someone like Spock or Picard, but he's very aware of his own weaknesses when he has them, and is able to confront them. I'm going to give him a 4 for confidence and clarity. But when it comes to charisma and inspiration, Riker is one of the most fun people to be around. He works hard to include everyone in whatever he's doing. He listens closely to his crewmates with genuine curiosity, and he has a great sense of humor and is well liked by all. Riker gets a 5 for charisma and inspiration. For moral intelligence, well, Riker is generally known for a fair approach to things, although he does not spend an intense amount of time grasping with moral issues. But I'll still give him a solid 4 for moral intelligence. For reputation, Riker is complicated. He accomplished some amazing things while serving on the Enterprise, and by all rights, he should have had his own command long before he finally sat down in the captain's chair. He is not quite a legendary leader, but he is accomplished enough in his own right by the end of TNG. I will reluctantly give him a 3. Overall, his score is 4.1, which puts him in A tier. Now let's do Riker's generational counterpart, Spock. Spock has found himself in the captain's chair of the Enterprise a number of times. At first when Kirk was unavailable, such as in the episode The Tholian Web, and then later when Kirk was Admiral, Spock was captain of the Enterprise, although we cannot say if this captaincy was only to train cadets as seen in Star Trek II, or if it had gone on long before then. Later in life he became an ambassador. For strategy and tactics, I really wrestled with this one, but one thing that Spock lacked in his earlier years was an understanding of trickery, but later a bit of Kirk seemed to rub off on him. So by the time of the movie era, he was perfectly willing to cast off Vulcan dogma and use trickery to defeat a foe, like he did with the false messages sent to Kirk in The Wrath of Khan. After all, he didn't lie, he exaggerated. And his knowledge and expertise about a variety of topics are impeccable, so I'm going to give Spock a 5 for strategy and tactics. When it comes to diplomacy and communication, he is very good at clearly and rationally explaining the situation to crew or potential adversaries to achieve the best possible outcome. He even managed to open a dialogue with the Klingon Chancellor Gorkin in Star Trek VI, which would lead to the Khitomer Accords, a first step in the road to the alliance of the Klingon Empire that would come later. And by the TNG era, he was a key influencer in the Romulan unification movement, an underground movement to help reunify the Romulans with their Vulcan ancestors. He gets a well-deserved 5 for diplomacy and communication. For trust and loyalty, in his early years he really struggled to achieve trust from human subordinates, as he seemed to lack a certain degree of understanding when it came to human emotions. He would eventually work through this to the point where there would be no question about trusting Spock's leadership. But he really had to earn it, so I'll give him a 4 here. Now when it comes to clarity and confidence, Spock's ability to come up with a plan and think clearly are unparalleled. Spock is one of those people who can deduce all the best options and choose one and confidently execute the plan. Spock gets a solid 5 for clarity and confidence. For inspiration and charm, well, this is a tough one. In the beginning, charisma was not Spock's strongest quality. Later in life, he learned how to use a kind of dry and subtle sense of humor to troll those silly humans. Spock certainly has charisma, but he's not for everyone. However, I know that there are die-hard Spock fans among the Star Trek community. So I have to give him at least a 4. Sometimes charisma is something that you can't quite put your finger on, and Spock has it. For moral intelligence, Spock normally sees the right thing to do as the most logical, and he has a certain code of duty and even sacrifice to the benefit of others. The only weakness here is that he does not always clue others in on what this is. So I'll give him a 4. Now for reputation, by the time of the Next Generation era, when Spock helped lead the reunification movement, Spock was a legendary figure. Spock gets a 5 for reputation. Spock's average is 4.6, and this puts Spock in S tier. Alright, now on to Commander and later Captain Sisko of Deep Space Nine. Sisko was no slouch when it comes to strategy and tactics. He has participated in many battles in his career, from the Battle of Wolf 359 to all the battles during the Dominion War. Hell, he even helped to design the Defiant as a tactical option for fighting the Borg. Sisko gets a solid 5 for strategy and tactics. For diplomacy and communication, he actually was kind of a powerhouse. Commanding a station under joint control of the Bajorans and Starfleet is no easy task. He reluctantly served his part as emissary to the Prophets for the Bajorans. He was able to host many people at odds on Deep Space Nine, and even coordinate joint actions in the Dominion War between the Federation, Klingons, and the Romulans. Those last two were not easy. So I have to give Sisko a 5 for diplomacy and communication. For trust and loyalty, Sisko's crew never had to question his competence or fairness in any situation. Here I also have to give him a 5. For clarity and confidence, although he very confidently carried out his orders, there were times when Sisko could lose his cool. He also was rather reluctant and conflicted about his role as the emissary to the Prophets, and this is understandable, but I think we'll give him a 3 for clarity and confidence. For inspiration and charisma, Sisko was impeccable. He had a good sense of humor, a lot of interesting personality traits, very affectionate with his crew and his family, and of course, by the Bajorans, he was seen as a spiritual figure, so he gets a 5 for inspiration and charisma. For moral intelligence, on this one he could struggle with quite a bit. Like many in Starfleet, he was raised in a utopian, idealized society, but when faced with the realities of war, he was faced with many ugly choices. His internal convictions were strong, and he wrestled with them, but in the end, he had to do what was right in many tough choices, so I'll give him a 4 here. Now for reputation, well, he often performed duties in the Dominion War that an admiral should be performing. He was the friggin' emissary to the Prophets. He was instrumental in opening the Gamma Quadrant to exploration, and then played a huge part in defeating the Dominion. Sisko gets a solid 5 for reputation. Sisko's overall rating puts him at 4.7, which puts him in S tier. Okay, let's get to Captain Archer from Star Trek Enterprise. Captain Archer is an interesting one. His Enterprise is one of the first Warp 5 ships, and he commanded it before the Federation or Starfleet was founded. When it comes to strategy and tactics, Archer found himself in a new conflict almost every week, as if violence had become Star Trek's default setting. Through this, he learned a great deal about at least strategy, and the tactics used by the ship were always evolving and being ironed out as new technology became available. There are no maneuvers or anything that really stand out in my head though when it comes to Archer, so we'll give Archer a 4 for strategy and tactics. For diplomacy and communication, I think Archer honestly started out pretty bad. He was always contentious, borderline racist with the Vulcans, and displayed a lot of naivety when it came to alien relations. Of course, by season 4 of Star Trek Enterprise, he would totally turn this around, so he was capable of learning. If more seasons of Enterprise had actually aired, we might have been able to see this major part in actually forming the Federation, which would give him a legendary diplomacy score. I can take that into account, but we never really got to see that. And he was pretty bad at first, so therefore I'll give Archer a 4 in diplomacy and communication. For trust and loyalty, there was a bit of a struggle for Archer here at first. He saw his Vulcan first officer as a kind of watchdog as much as anything else. Later on, through some struggle, he would gain the trust of his crew, so I'll give Archer a 4 for trust and loyalty. For clarity and confidence, this is going to be lower. Archer acted as if his orders were always under scrutiny from his first officer or others. He did not always have the best temper, and a bit of paranoia always stuck with him. I will give him a 3 for clarity and confidence. For inspiration and charisma, although Archer had his charms, there was nothing particularly distinguishing about his personality. I'll give Archer a 3 for inspiration and charisma. For moral intelligence, well, in general, he was known to do the right thing, but after Earth had been attacked by the Xindi, at one point he even used enhanced interrogation techniques to try to learn more about the next attack. He did so without regard to the example he was setting. One could blame the writers of Enterprise for this, but it's not just the fictional effect we have to consider, it's the fans of the show that are affected as well. I don't think this played well with the Star Trek fans, and no one wants to watch a Starship commander with questionable morals. So I have to give him a 2 for moral intelligence. For reputation, if Archer did go on to found the Federation, and I think I'll give him that, he would have a legendary reputation. But unfortunately, this never plays out, and later on in Star Trek history, Archer is barely even mentioned, so I give him a 4 here. This gives him a total score of 3.9, which puts him in B tier. Alright, now on to Kathryn Janeway. Janeway's an interesting captain. She's aggressive, tough, has aptitudes in science, and has a lot of technical knowledge. Over the years of her voyage across the galaxy, she has changed and gained a lot of experience. She is a great tactician, but there is nothing in particular, no particular maneuver or anything that defines her. I'll give her a 4 for strategy and tactics. For diplomacy and communication, she is certainly very competent, having been in extremely diplomatically challenging situations. She even negotiated with the Borg when they were under attack from species 8472. I'm sure this will be debated a bit, but I'll give her a 5 in the area of diplomacy and communication. For trust and loyalty, consider she started in the Delta Quadrant with a mixed crew of both Maquis and Starfleet. She was dealt a very challenging hand from the beginning, but over time, she was able to gain complete trust from her crew. Janeway would often go to enormous lengths to protect and support her crew, often at her own expense. I'll give her a 5 for trust and loyalty. For clarity and confidence, Janeway is probably one of the toughest captains ever. She is always very clear about her convictions and never fears for herself, but sometimes fears a little too much for the crew despite their shenanigans, often going out of her way for them, which can sometimes cloud her judgment, but I'll give her a 4 for clarity and confidence. For inspiration and charisma, Janeway was a force of nature. She could have a motherly, nurturing manner, but also a person who had an unusual talent for making people hold themselves accountable. Essential with a crew that is often unruly, Janeway also has the ability to use her own human vulnerability as a charming feature. Janeway also has a lot of interesting quirks that distinguish her, such as her coffee addiction. Janeway has very pleasant mannerisms and ways of speaking. Janeway's enthusiasm for exploration and discovery is also very infectious. I have to give Janeway a 5 for charisma and inspiration. For Janeway's moral intelligence, she faltered really only once when facing the renegade crew of the Equinox. However, she did hold her moral values together in the end, but Janeway has a very self-righteous view of her moral wisdom, which she often deserves since she is actually correct in most of her moral assessments. But I'll give Janeway a 4 here. And finally, reputation. Janeway's reputation with her unusual ship all the way on the other side of the galaxy, even in the Delta Quadrant. Her future self, in a maddening paradox, sacrificed herself to cripple the Borg with her virus, and in the end Janeway was able to get the Voyager back to the Alpha Quadrant, and soon after, earned an admiralty for it. I'll give Janeway a 5 in the reputation category. Janeway's overall rating is 4.4, which puts her in A tier. And now let's evaluate perhaps the most famous starship captain in all of Star Trek, perhaps in all of sci-fi, James T. Kirk. Now let's get right into the strategic and tactical mind of Kirk. Kirk first displayed his strategic and tactical prowess when fighting the Romulans in the episode Balance of Terror, which resembles a kind of World War II submarine battle. Kirk defeated a very experienced Romulan commander, and he later fought many other battles throughout his career. What stands out about Kirk is really illustrated in the episode The Corbomite Maneuver. When Spock was certain the situation was hopeless, comparing the situation to a checkmate in chess, Kirk tells Spock, "Not chess, Mr. Spock, poker," and then crafted a bluff about Corbomite, which every Federation ship supposedly had. This substance allowed Federation ships to deflect any attack upon them back to the attacker. This tells you that Kirk really is more like Sun Tzu when it comes to strategy and tactics, and how all good strategy in war use deceptive practices. This knack for traps and trickery were a prevailing recurrence in Kirk's modus operandi. This is also something that is a role model for myself. I'd say early on I learned that Kirk's way is a great way for strategy and tactics. But this is a quality that highly logical people such as Spock often fail to grasp, and it allows Kirk to overcome the odds. I'll give Kirk a solid 5 for strategy and tactics. For diplomacy and communication, while Kirk was very talented when it comes to communication and reaching out with a friendly hand, he often preferred actions to deliberation, and preferred diplomacy through strength. You could think of Kirk as a kind of protector. Of course, when dealing with something like Klingons, Kirk could easily get his feathers ruffled. I'll give Kirk a 4 for diplomacy and communication. For trust and loyalty, Kirk has a crew that had great affection for him and would certainly go out of their way for him even at their own expense. There was no question about whether you could trust Kirk. He of course on occasion would defy authority, but only when it was absolutely justified. It is interesting to note that his greatest offense to Starfleet Command was because he valued a friend in Spock, which led to the events in Star Trek III. It's interesting how loyalty and leadership goes both ways. Being loyal to your crew is just as important as their loyalty to their captain. I'll give Kirk a 5 when it comes to trust and loyalty. For clarity and confidence, Kirk usually had an impeccable degree of confidence, but he often confided, especially in McCoy, that sometimes his confidence was only a front. Kirk is extremely intelligent, but he also internally quite emotional. He can be hot-blooded and even a bit impatient when it comes to his orders being carried out. However, Kirk is also an extremely quick thinker, perhaps even more so than Spock, who calculates, while Kirk is already seemingly doing the right move by instinct. I'll give Kirk a 4 when it comes to clarity and confidence. For inspiration and charisma, well, there really isn't much of a debate here. Kirk's infectious enthusiasm for any adventure that is being undertaken is irresistible. He has a great sense of humor. He's capable of giving grand inspirational speeches. He's genuinely curious and caring about his crew. His manner is pleasant and he smiles in conversation. He's quite possibly the most charming leader in all of Star Trek. So Kirk gets a solid 5 for inspiration and charisma. For moral intelligence, Kirk does have an impeccable degree of moral wisdom, but he can struggle with self-doubt. He's not really quite a deep thinker about moral wisdom until kind of later in his career. Overall, he has a solid moral compass, so I'll give him a 4 for moral intelligence. For reputation, well, Kirk has saved Earth on at least 2 occasions, as well as other worlds. He's prevented interstellar war by defeating the Romulans. He did so again for the Klingons in Star Trek VI. Kirk's strategies are studied in Starfleet Command School. He was regarded by the Klingons as at least a Klingon in their own eyes by the end of his career. Of course, for the Klingons, defeating Kirk in battle was the ultimate prize. Kirk is certainly the most famous captain in the Star Trek universe. He gets a solid 5 for reputation. Kirk averages 4.7, which puts him in S tier. And last but not least, Jean-Luc Picard. Captain Picard's strategy and tactical knowledge are fairly solid. He is named for the Picard maneuver, which he used against the Ferengi to save his ship the Stargazer, which he eventually would become captain of. Also in the episode The Defector, Picard used a combination of strategy and diplomacy by deliberately walking into the suspected Romulan trap while preparing a trap of his own, covertly using Klingon allies to stand off against Tomalak's warbirds, and then de-escalating the situation. Picard is not quite at the level of Kirk, however, when it comes to strategy and tactics, but I'll give him a 4, but he more than makes up for it in other qualities. For diplomacy and communication, Picard has de-escalated so many potentially violent situations it's hard for me to count. I would say growing up that Picard was my role model for de-escalation and how to talk to people. Rather than going in with a loaded gun, first, find out why the situation is heated in the first place, and then start to talk through it. In this way, Picard could talk himself out of many fights. Even when he had the option of destroying the other side, he preferred de-escalation. Picard took a measured approach to all diplomatic situations, and he seemed to always have a contingency if things really went badly. He also used these communication skills with his crew, and he was able to utilize all of his crew, creating a powerful synergy amongst the crew that we haven't seen since. I have to give Picard a solid 5 for diplomacy and communication. For trust and loyalty, it's interesting when Picard was temporarily replaced by Captain Jellicoe in the episode Chain of Command, and Jellicoe ended up being a taskmaster for the Enterprise command crew, especially Riker. I remember Riker telling him that Jellicoe did not foster an atmosphere of trust. Picard was amazing in this ability to get people's trust, and also show implicit trust in his crew's abilities. If his crew ever had doubts about their abilities, he would always assure them that they had to try to execute, and he would be there for them, and they would go through it together. There's no better way of gaining another's trust by letting them know why they're valuable, and that they must trust themselves, because they're going to get through it together. Picard would offer a strong hand to whoever is down and lift them up. Picard gets a strong 5 for trust and loyalty. For confidence and clarity, here again Picard is my role model. He deliberated with calm, thought at length, and then when he did make a decision, he was clear and confident about it. He had a head so cool that Spock commented Picard was almost a Vulcan in quality. He would of course raise his voice with conviction at times, but this was not really an out-of-control anger, but often very necessary. Picard is as clear-headed as Spock, General Chang, and perhaps even Grand Admiral Thrawn from Star Wars. I'll give Picard a good 5 here. For inspiration and charm, Picard struggles in some regards, especially with his awkwardness around children and his general awkwardness in what would seem to be undignified situations. Of course, Picard could give the most inspiring speeches and quote the most inspiring phrases from Shakespeare or wherever. Picard's social awkwardness would fade over time, and his sense of humor would eventually come out. I know this one might be a bit debated, but I think I'll give Picard a 4 for inspiration and charisma. For moral intelligence, Picard is a man who is practically a scholar when it comes to history and the mistakes or achievements people have made in the past. This gives him a very good foundation for his moral compass. I would go so far as to say Picard never had any doubts about what was right or wrong, but not in a helter-skelter or self-righteous way. He simply has no patience for moral ineptitude. Picard is a deep thinker about moral situations and always tried to take everything into deep consideration. I will give Picard a 5 when it comes to moral intelligence. And finally, reputation. Captain Picard already had a very good reputation by the time he assumed command of the Enterprise D. He was already on good terms with the Admiralty of Starfleet, seeming to know or be friends with many of them. He probably could have been far higher ranked than captain by the time he took command of the Enterprise, but he preferred to remain a captain. He, of course, through his force of will, resisted assimilation of the Borg just enough to communicate with Data before the Borg were able to assimilate Earth. So yes, Picard, like Kirk, can be considered an Earth savior at least twice. He also helped to save many other worlds from disasters, prevented war with the Romulans through de-escalation, and has so many accomplishments that it's hard to count. Picard's reputation is a solid 5. This brings his overall score to 4.7 to be equal to Kirk. Also in S tier. Alright, now that we're at the end of this list, I realize there's so many Starship captains I might have left off the list that I could have added, but this video is already much longer than what I usually make. So please, if you disagree with me or if you have some input about how I'm grading these Starship captains, say so in the comments, or mention some other commanders or Starship captains that I have not put in the list. Perhaps if this video does well, I will go into other sci-fi universes and make a tier list about those leaders as well. Also, this Galaxy class starship here that I've made in Blender 3D, I now have available on CG Trader, which is linked in the description, and on my Patreon page at patreon.com/resurrected. Certain high-tier members can go ahead and get all of my models there, or you can purchase the models directly from that Resurrected Starship's Patreon page if you like, without becoming a member, among many other models. Alright, I hope everyone's having a good spring. I'm going to put my nose down and start working on the next video. Until next time, space friends.